This is Secret File, and I'm your host, Peter Grant. Today, I'm very excited to be presenting to you a conversation I had with just an extraordinary investigative reporter, author, documentary producer, and musician, Gus Russo. Gus is one of the leading researchers and authorities on the JFK assassination. He's written two books on the matter. The first was published in 1998 called Live by the Sword: The Secret War Against Castro and the Death of JFK. Years later, he co wrote another book on the JFK assassination, this one with Wilfried Huisman, entitled Brothers in Arms: The Kennedys, the Castros, and the Politics of Murder. Gus was also a top researcher for a four-episode Frontline on Lee Harvey Oswald. In addition to his interest in the JFK assassination, Gus is also an expert on organized crime in Chicago. In 2002, he authored The Outfit: The Role of Chicago's Underworld in the Shaping of Modern America. And we'll get into both the JFK assassination and the Chicago underworld in this podcast. My personal favorite work by Gus, and that's actually hard to say because he's written so many excellent books, is his book Supermob: How Sidney Korshak and His Criminal Associates Became America's Hidden Power Brokers. This was published in 2006. And in it, Gus takes an enormously important conceptual leap and develops the idea of what he calls the supermob. And these aren't just straight gangsters, but these are lawyers, financiers, individuals in the legitimate business world, real estate brokers, who work with organized crime and serve as an interface between the worlds of the underground economy and the legitimate economy. And this is an area that hasn't been explored as much as it ought to, and Gus is an absolute leader in the field on it. So anyways, I don't particularly like to give long introductions. I generally like to dive right in to the conversation. So without further ado, I present to you my conversation with Gus Russo. I hope you enjoy it. I am here with author, investigative reporter, and scholar Gus Russo. Gus, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thanks for asking.
So we have a lot of interesting subjects that we're going to discuss today. So let's just dive right in. As I mentioned in the introduction, Gus is one of the foremost experts on the JFK assassination. Here we are over 6 decades after that terrible event, and interest in the subject is deep and widespread and remains strong. So my first question to you, Gus, is it's not surprising, given how important and traumatic that event was in American politics, that you would be interested in that. But what was the path you took to becoming a much more disciplined researcher and writer on the subject matter? How did your life lead you in that direction?
Well, let's see. One of my good friends, I mentioned that my life very often is like a stream of consciousness. And one of my good friends says, in your case, Gus, it's more like a puddle of consciousness. But be that as it may, I was alive when it happened, obviously, and being from a Italian Catholic family, it was almost like we were Irish Catholic. We worshipped Kennedy so much. So it was much more traumatizing to the Catholics who were our first Catholic president and all that. My parents just revered the first couple so much. So it was a really, really big deal for us, especially. And so it was traumatizing, but you sort of forgot about it after a while. And that didn't forget, but you put it on the back burner because it was what it was. It happened. And after that big weekend, then you moved on. And the Warren report came out a year later. And what most people don't realize is 80% of the country sort of bought the Warren Commission, that Oswald did it alone. And I was probably along with that, although I was a young teenager. I was following it pretty closely. I didn't really get into it more until Rush to Judgment came out by Mark Lane, which I think was 1966. And that book supposedly raised so many questions. It had so many conspiratorial things to it. And being a young person, I never thought that an author would make this up or would be lying to his readers, which in fact Mark Lane was, took everything out of context, which I learned years later. But that was enough to get, pretty much a generation, especially of young men, really interested in the case in a major way. That book, seemed like it had all the answers to a big government conspiracy. Uh, and I was, later to find out that that wasn't the case. And Mark Lane was not a very credible or ethical writer. So that got me going. And I started reading all the books, all the magazines, like a lot of us did. But what really jumped it into high gear was I was living in New York as a musician. I moved up from Maryland up to New York after college. And but I maintained my friendships in Maryland and DC. And when the HSCA kicked in the late 70s, I would come down for their public hearings. And I got to meet a lot of the staff and various people on the commission. I spoke to Blakey in 78 as a
So
young
just to
guy.
briefly, just to get, so the that's the
Oh, sorry.
House Committee on Assassinations.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah, the House Select Committee on Assassinations was looking into it, and they had a good number of open hearings, and I would always trek down from New York to be there and to meet with my friends. I met the council, Robert Blakey, and a few of the other members, and Kevin Walsh, Scott Malone, different people on the staff became really good friends. And that led me to get more serious about it because they there was a lot of secrecy. The staff had told me that the CIA wasn't cooperating with the committee. They were withholding, just trainloads of documents. And I said, okay, there must be something here for them to do that. At the same time, I was convinced that Oswald was the shooter by what the committee had done, but I knew there was more to it from being immersed in that. So what I did was, on my own time, it's my spare time, I would start calling up people who I could find who were witnesses or were related in some way to the case, from FBI agents to people in Dallas. Funny enough, when my band was touring, I had a Rolodex of different people connected to the case. And if we were playing in a city where somebody lived, I said, "Oh, that was the FBI guy who was there with the casket. He lives here in Milwaukee. I'll call him up." While we were out of town or wherever we were, I would try to connect with people. And it really got amazing because people opened up to me, I guess, because I wasn't threatening. I wasn't writing a book. I was just a guy who was interested, and everybody spoke to me. And if you do that long enough, you learn some things that aren't in the public record, which I started to learn. And there you go. The first time I did it professionally was in 1988. Jack Anderson was doing a special on who killed Kennedy, 25th anniversary, and I wrote to him. A lot of my friends worked for Jack Anderson. He really started a lot of young people's professional journalism careers, friends of mine especially. And so I got in touch and I said, I have a lot of files here, a lot of interviews. And so they didn't hire me, but they paid me as a consultant and I would send them whatever. And I got a real taste for the documentary world and moved on from there, writing proposals and doing my own thing. But that's what did it, HSCA to Jack Anderson. Short story long.
Okay. And so when you went into it, you say that you had thought that Oswald was the shooter, but clearly there has been a lot of talk about a wider conspiracy. Were you open to that idea initially, or were you mostly fairly convinced that Oswald acted alone?
Well, initially, I mean, if you're talking about 1963 and 64, I thought that he had acted alone. And I skipped over one thing. Right after Rush to Judgment, of course, Jim Garrison said he had solved it. So and Mark Lane was his consultant down there in New Orleans. Jim Garrison was the DA in New Orleans who actually was depicted in the movie JFK, who charged a local businessman, Clay Shaw, with being involved in the assassination. So there again, I figured, well, a DA wouldn't go to all of this unless he had something. He must know something. So that also fueled my thinking that even though Oswald seemed to, well, at that point, I didn't know who the shooter was. It wasn't until the House committee that I resolved that. At this point, I was wide open to anything, in the late '60s. And then the House committee science panels convinced me that Oswald was the shooter alone.
And one of the things that you've written about quite extensively and is critical context to the events that led up to the assassination itself are American clandestine activities in Cuba, including a variety of plots to assassinate Castro, started under Eisenhower, later continued on into the Kennedy assassination. I mean, the Kennedy administration. Would you, for our listeners, maybe just provide a little bit of contextual information on what was America's relationship with Cuba and the attempted assassinations of Castro and how that fit in
Mhm.
through up to the Kennedy administration?
Yeah, well, Castro overthrew the Batista regime, which was very corrupt with America as a partner and a lot of American businesses. Uh, and when Batista was overthrown, Castro uh, wanted to have an alliance with America, with the United States, but we turned him down because he was nationalizing a lot of the corporations that were down there, including Joe Kennedy's Coca-Cola bottling plant. Uh, and So we turned him down, and then he turned to Russia and became quote unquote a communist or a Marxist. And uh, that was the kiss of death in those days. If you were a Marxist or a communist, America was automatically your enemy. And so Eisenhower and Kennedy both felt that politically speaking, if nothing else, they could not exist with a communist nation 90 miles off the coast of Florida. So they, you know, decided to try to get rid of him and just to try to bring down the regime. Eisenhower first brought in the Chicago mob to help out because the mob had connections still in Havana, and that wasn't successful, obviously. And the idea was to get rid of Fidel Castro, the president. And then the Kennedy administration came in, and the same thing. They were all, you have to understand, Nixon, Kennedy, everybody was a hawk in those days. It was communist hysteria. So the Kennedys felt pretty much the same way. But Bobby Kennedy didn't want to work with the mob, so he brought Cuban exiles who would come into America. He worked with them to establish the same thing to get rid of Fidel Castro. Uh, Before he did that, the Bay of Pigs happened right after Kennedy was inaugurated, and that was a failure because the Chicago mob decided they weren't going to help Eisenhower or Kennedy anymore because they became upset with JFK for appointing Bobby as Attorney General. Bobby hated the mob, and the mob had made this deal with the previous White House to help. So their role in this was to kill Castro during the Bay of Pigs invasion. But Sam Giancana basically said, okay, screw them. We're going to stand down. And so they didn't kill Castro during the invasion. And that was a major defeat for the Kennedy administration. Then Bobby goes into high gear and brings in Cuban exiles who were willing to try to do it. And that's what went on for the next couple of years. A lot of attempts, nothing successful. But that was the backdrop, and that was one of the big secrets both the CIA had been keeping and was kept from the Warren Commission. That's what they didn't know about those plots.
And so a key part of, and you hear this time and time again for those with the narrative that there was a larger conspiracy at play, was that there was this sense of enormous betrayal within the CIA and among the Cuban exile population when Kennedy refused to use the American military to support the invasion. Do you have anything to say about that? Is that the case? Was that true?
Well, the Cuban exiles in Miami certainly turned against Kennedy because 99% of them didn't know that he was continuing in the plotting. It was a big secret. It was only a small number of Cubans knew that he was serious and he hadn't abandoned them. But most Cuban exiles became Republicans. They said, he botched the Bay of Pigs and he doesn't care about us anymore when he really did. And Bobby really did as well. And Bobby was running it out of Langley. So that perception, as you state, that the Cuban exiles hated JFK, it's true. That doesn't mean they wanted to kill him. And there's no evidence that they had anything to do with it. But yeah, they hated him. And to this day, you can look at that whole period as the reason Democrats still keep losing Florida, because the Cuban exiles have big sway in Miami and elsewhere. And they are all mostly still Republican. I was hoping that my work would convince them that Kennedy never abandoned them. In fact, he died for them at the hands of a pro-Castro guy, and that might turn some of those Republicans into Democrats at some point. But that's Pollyanna.
Yeah, well, that's probably a good segue into Lee Harvey Oswald himself.
Hmm.
So, would you give a little bit of a background to Oswald? Who was he, where he came from, and how he ended up um, in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963?
Well, he had lived in Fort Worth. He'd lived in Texas before, and when he was young, he lived in New Orleans and New York. His mother had trundled him all over the South and the Southwest. He didn't have a father in his life, um, and and his brother was in Texas. So after Oswald, who was Oswald? Let me just go back. Oswald, in my opinion, was very disturbed. He was a violent man. There's multiple episodes and examples of violence in his life. Um, and, so he also believed that he was special. His mother had told him since he was a toddler, "You're special, Lee. You're going to change the world. You're special." Of course, he didn't have any gifts to really be special, but he thought he was. And, the bottom line is he was very disturbed. You look at his history, everybody who knew him talks about it. Um, and so that's the character. When I first met Blakey Chief Counsel Blakey for the HSCA back in 1978 or 79, I asked him, I said, so who was this guy Oswald? And he said, that if you'd have knocked on any door in Oak Cliff in Dallas neighborhood, a neighborhood where Oswald was rooming, he said you could knock on most doors in that neighborhood and find a guy just like him. This is Blakey's words, he was poor white trash. And he was violent, poor white trash. And he turned, Blakey was right about that. After my looking into it, I suggest for people, if they want to know who Oswald was, read this one book that's just amazing, Marina and Lee, written with Marina as a co-author actually on it over many years with Priscilla Johnson McMillan. And Marina told her co-author exactly who Lee was. He beat her remorselessly, uh, constantly with his fists. He was a wife beater, and he tortured her. He kept her in this hot apartment on the second floor with he wouldn't allow her to have friends or even to learn English. She was a kept woman, and he was just awful. She tried to kill herself. Not many people know it because not many people read that book. Not many of the conspiracy people read it, but she was so despondent, Marina, that she tried to hang herself, and Lee walked in and caught her in the bathroom with a rope around her neck. That's what she was driven to by this madman. Um, it's another point. He tried to murder General Walker in Dallas. He tried to stab his brother's sister when he was a teenager. It was one thing after another. This guy had a temper, and he was definitely not a CIA agent. He's not the kind of stock that the CIA used for their analysts or operatives or case officers. That's for sure. Um, And
Do you believe that he was a truly dedicated Marxist in any with any sophistication, or was that more kind of a contrarian? Because again, sometimes when people are discussing
mhm.
background to Oswald, the question of was he actually a Marxist comes up.
Well, in his mind, he was, uh, but it was more that he wanted to be different than everybody else. And if everybody else was a liberal Democrat, he wanted to be a Marxist. He just had to stand out from the crowd. That was a part of his psyche. But in his mind, he was. But I'll tell you, later on, I did a show on Frontline, a big, big 2-year investigation where we interviewed hundreds of people, and among those people was the State Department employee and who was in Moscow when Oswald was there. I didn't say for people who don't know, after he was in the Marines, Oswald went to Russia for 3 years. He tried to he said he was going to defect, and that State Department official told us that he said, "I'm going to defect because I'm a Marxist," and his knowledge of Marxism was so scant that the State Department man had to tell them, "Well, you're going to be awfully lonely in Russia. There's no Marxists here anymore." Lee didn't even know that. Uh, it seemed to me he was the kind of a guy who would read 1 or 2 pages of a book, Das Kapital or whatever, and then cling to it for the rest of his life. He was a quasi-intellectual. And yeah, and we saw more about that later when he debated people in New Orleans about Marxism. Anyway, so that's what the level of his Marxist belief was. He and his mother hated you have to understand, he was raised alone by her, and she was certifiable, Marguerite Oswald. His brothers both told me that they left early and joined the military to get away from her, but they felt so bad they had left their younger brother Lee alone with this woman. She, when he was a baby, they said she would rock him, Lee, in her arms, and instead of singing nursery rhymes or whatever, she would just say how cruel this government is. They won't give me your father's military pension, the father who had deceased. Uh, and this is the worst government in the world, Lee, but you're special, Lee. And this is what he grew up with. So that's who he was. And did I get to your question? I'm not sure.
Well, that's all right. I mean, I think yes, you did. And so when he was in Russia, at one point, I think the Russians were fairly perplexed by him. At one point, they were going to send him back, and he almost committed suicide in Moscow. Is that the case?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they thought he was nuts. That's the one thing all the different governments involved had in common, be it Russia, America, Mexico, Cuba. They all knew he was nuts and violent. We interviewed all for one of those shows. We interviewed the KGB guys in Russia who were monitoring him. They dispatched a whole brigade of KGB agents to monitor him when he was living there because they couldn't figure out what he was. But what they mostly heard was him beating up his wife, and after he married Marina, there, a Russian girl, and yeah, so they knew he was out of it. They were kind of afraid of him because they thought he was going to start a big international incident. That's why when he got bored with Russia and asked to come back, they quickly said, "Go, we're not going to stop you." That's what people say. How did he get his return visa so quick? Because they didn't want to have anything to do with him. And Marina had more of a problem getting out, but not Lee.
And so when he returned to the United States, some of the people that he was interacting with while he was in Dallas, married to Marina, I can never pronounce this guy's name, George de Moranschild. Is that
DeMorenshield.
de Moranschild? Yeah. So people have said that he had a background in intelligence, and oftentimes people point that out as being a suspicious anomaly. So do you know anything about how they entered into one another's orbit and what the nature of that relationship was?
Sure. Well, DeMorenshield was an international traveler and geologist. And what people today don't understand is that if you were a world traveler back then at the height of communist hysteria, the CIA tried to get a relationship with you as a contact. And not as an operative or a killer or or a case officer. They just wanted to talk to you about what you saw when you were in Argentina or wherever you went. And yes, so that to that degree, he and about 25,000 other international businessmen were CIA contacts. That's the extent of it. Um, so he had sort of glommed onto Oswald, as many people did when they came from Russia to Fort Worth, because they saw the condition Marina was in. And I interviewed a lot of those so-called white Russians who adopted the Oswalds, and they told me it was because of Marina and how she was always black and blue. She was bruised. She couldn't speak any English because her husband wouldn't let her learn. And they were kind of protective of her. Now, de Mohrenschildt became really fascinated with her husband. Most of them did. Most of them hated Oswald. They knew him for what he was. De Mohrenschildt became fascinated with him and thought he was a genuine 20th century character, which he was. And I don't know if you would call them friends, but uh, you know, that's it. De Mohrenschildt was not an assassin for the CIA. He did not encourage Oswald to shoot anybody, but he was fascinated with him, and he wrote a manuscript about their relationship and so forth. But what you have to do with this case is first figure out who pulled the trigger, then work backwards from there. And that's what we've always done. And once you realize Oswald did it all, you have to see who really was close to him. And outside of de Mohrenschildt, Oswald was a loner. Nobody was with this guy. And de Mohrenschildt was just fascinated with how kind of wacky he was, and some of the things he said sounded revolutionary and whatever. But that was the extent of it. De Mohrenschildt had nothing to do with the assassination or hating Kennedy or anything like that.
And do you know whether once Oswald returned from the Soviet Union, was the CIA like keeping tabs on him at all, or was he? Because sometimes people, are pointing out that James Angleton or someone was kind of manipulating him,
Sure.
and I haven't seen them present any affirmative, definitive evidence towards that, but they point out that there were like cables where they were talking about Oswald and.
Yeah, what they won't tell you is there are cables where they talk about anybody who defected. He was a defector. Of course, they were going to try to figure out what that was about. Was he going to turn over any secrets? Was he flipping over to the KGB? The CIA would be deficient if they didn't have a file on him, but they had him on other people. Not that a lot of people went to the Soviet Union in 1959, but that's their job. Of course, they had a file on him. There's no evidence whatsoever. In fact, it's complete opposite of that, that the CIA had what some people are calling Operation Oswald. That's just a fantasy. It's a myth. And people want to believe it. That's their business, but they'll never find any evidence for it. In fact, just the opposite. They handed him off to the FBI when he came back to America. The FBI did some interviews with him, and they also thought he was crazy and wasn't giving up anything of use, so they stopped even interviewing him. But yeah, there's no meaningful contact between Oswald and the CIA, and therefore there's no evidence of it.
Right. And oftentimes, particularly in this case, people can get off into the weeds of ballistics and and the movement of Kennedy's head when he got shot and the whole magic bullet theory. And that kind of, I don't want to get off into the minutia of that, but just suffice it to say that given the amount of time that you've spent looking at all that evidence, you feel that it's definitive that there was a single shooter, and that it makes it, despite that it might be counterintuitive the way that he moved, it could be explained from where Oswald was, from the book depository and whatnot.
100%. And just to talk about the counterintuitive thing, I know you don't want to get into the weeds, but on that one thing,
I'm happy to do it if you'd like to as well.
Oh yeah, it's up to you. On that one thing of his head movement, what Oliver Stone didn't show the public, but what we saw when we went to those HSCA hearings, we saw a crystal clear version, as you could get, of the Zapruder film. That's one of the reasons I wanted to go to the hearings, to see the first showing of the first generation Zapruder film. It had never been seen before, and I was pretty much in the front row. I had snuck into the witness area to look at it, and JFK's head went forward first. When you go frame by frame on a clear Zapruder film, JFK's head snaps forward and then back. It's a whiplash. And the forward motion is really dramatic. You don't do that naturally in your life. His head was pushed forward and whipsawed backwards when the explosion came out of the front, which is actually very normal for a shot in the head. Uh, that looked counterintuitive. If you missed that one frame, all you saw was his head go backwards, right? Uh, but even that, the way the head reacts to, and this was what the committee learned, and I've actually seen films of firing squads. Very often the head goes towards the shooter because the clean entry doesn't do too much. It might be a quick snap, but the bigger movement is when the brains under pressure form a vacuum cavity and they explode out. So it went both ways, went forwards and backwards. And that is not abnormal for if you get shot in the head. So, yeah, that's the simple. There's a lot of other nitpick things that they do about the grains of the bullet and all that, but you don't want to get into that. The evidence is overwhelming that Oswald, even Blakey, knew that Oswald was the only one who shot Kennedy. But later he thought he heard a tape of somebody else shooting and missing, which turned out to be bogus, but he bought into it. But even he would say Oswald fired all the shots that hit Kennedy and Connolly. So whoever else was shooting, and there wasn't anybody, missed the whole car, missed the whole Dealey Plaza, missed everything. But it was just Oswald.
And so another thing that has led people to believe that there might have been something more nefarious behind it than the lone gunman is the fact that Oswald described himself as a patsy, and people point to that a lot. And then, of course, there is the fact that he himself was shot by Jack Ruby. And a lot of people have attempted to link Ruby to certain organized crime, individuals linked with organized crime. So maybe if you could just talk a little bit about who was Jack Ruby and how he ended up where he did, killing Oswald on live television.
And I saw it when I was a kid. We were glued to the TV all weekend, and the only time we left was to go to mass on Sunday because there was a special mass for President Kennedy. And we raced home and turned the TV right back on. And within 5 minutes, we're watching Oswald walk out. Boom. So, in fact, I think to this day, with all the cameras we have today, I think it's still the only murder committed live on television. Think about that. With all the murders we've had and all the cameras that are out there now, I still think so. That's how incredible seeing that was. Anyway, who was Ruby? Oh boy. I interviewed so many people who knew Ruby. He was a devout Jew. His real name was Jacob Rubenstein, and that actually is meaningful in what he did. He had moved to Dallas from Chicago to get away from the criminals. He was a FBI informant, and he felt his life was in danger in Chicago. In fact, he was told it was. So he moved to Dallas and established a new life as a nightclub owner, which was a hangout for all the local cops, just a couple blocks from the police station. And he was a great friend of the cops. He loved the Dallas police. He had a card in his wallet calling him an honorary sheriff of the Dallas Police Department. This is like supposedly a mob hitman. He's friendly with the police, right? And he worshipped President Kennedy. You could talk to his comedians in his club or his waiters or his strippers, and we spoke to all those people. They were consistent. They were at the total unanimity that that Ruby loved President Kennedy, to the extent that if one of the comedians told a joke about President Kennedy in the nightclub, Jack fired him instantly. That was a rule. You just don't joke about President Kennedy in his club. So here he is, a devout Jew, a lover of the police department, a lover of President Kennedy, and a lover of Dallas. And he was also short-tempered, and he didn't have real mob connections. He left them being around the mob in Chicago. His mob connections essentially were the same as practically every strip club owner in the Southwest from Louisiana over to Arkansas, wherever, Dallas, you didn't get your dancers, as they call them today, or your booze without knowing people in organized crime. That's who really controlled that area. So yeah, he knew people in Louisiana. He knew people in Texas. The mob in those days was big into the nightclub business. You know, ask Frank Sinatra or Dean Martin. They knew everybody, because if you were going to work in a club, you had to know those people because they owned all the good clubs. That's the extent of his mob connection. That is it. Why did he kill Oswald? That's a fascinating story. It might take a couple minutes, but I think it's worth it. And I got this from his diary, which I got from his brother during one of our investigations. I got it from his friends, we interviewed his rabbi. They all know why he did it. Pretty much everybody in Dallas knows why he did it. He was just bereft. I mean, he was crying. His strippers said, "We never saw Jack cry before," when Kennedy was shot. And this is, again, a mob hitman bawling his eyes out. He, being a police lover, he was at the police station. One cop said he was here every day of his life. He just loved hanging out at the police station. So he was there that weekend as well when all this was going down. He said, "I'm going to find out what's going on." And he goes down to the police station. But what really got him, the morning of the assassination, before it happened, the Dallas Morning News had a full-page ad calling Kennedy a traitor. And it was paid for. At the bottom, you saw paid for by Bernard Weissman, a Jewish guy. This drove Jack Ruby nuts. Okay, he couldn't believe that a Jewish man would call JFK a traitor, and he couldn't forget about it that whole weekend. In fact, when he wasn't at the police station, he was driving around Dallas looking for this guy Weissman. He was going to nail him for doing this, for making the Jews look so bad. When he couldn't find him, then Ruby starts thinking that there isn't a real Bernard Weissman. That's people trying to frame the Jews. Well, there really was a Bernard Weissman, and he's still around. He was on a documentary just a couple of years ago, but Ruby never found him. So what was going on in his head when Oswald came out that Sunday morning? Oh, by the way, he didn't even know Oswald was going to be there. Ruby did not go downtown that day to shoot Oswald. He was home pretty much in his underwear. According to his roommate, George Senator, he was sitting there like we were back in Maryland, glued to the TV, and he was too. Oswald was supposed to have been moved to a new jail, to a new prison at 9:30, and Ruby was sitting home watching it on TV. He gets a call from one of his strippers saying, "I need some money quick. I'm going to get evicted. Could you send me $25?" So Jack says, "Okay, I'll go down to the Western Union and send you a wiregram." He puts his beloved dog in the car. Again, this is a mob hitman. He takes his dog for a ride. He worshipped this dog, Sheba. And he told some people it was like his wife. And he puts his beloved dog in for just a short ride downtown, the mob hitman. And he goes to the Western Union, waits patiently in line. It's now 11:15. He's in the Western Union. His dog's waiting for him in the car on a hot Dallas day or a warm day. And Jack thinks he's going to be out in a minute and drive off. So he waits patiently in line while Oswald is supposedly he's already been transferred. Jack thinks it's all done, as did everybody else. But that transfer had been postponed, and Jack didn't know that. Nobody knew that. So when he comes out of the post office after waiting patiently to send a telegram, no rush to send this moneygram, he looks down the street, happened to be just down the street from the police station, and there's a crowd down there. He says, what's that? So he probably says to his dog, "I'll be back in a minute, Sheba." He walks down and to the ramp of the police station, and there's the crowd. He makes his way down the ramp because all the cops know him. Oh, it's just Jack. Come on down, Jack. He gets down there, and we know the time he got there, and based on the stamp on the wiregram and how long it takes to walk from Western Union, he got there with seconds to spare before Oswald showed his ugly mug walking out on the doorway with Jim Lavelle, the detective, and Ruby just lost it. thinking of all this stuff about that's going on with the Jews and how they're going to be framed for the Kennedy assassination, he snapped, which he said in his diary, which he said to his brother, which he said to everybody. He said, when he was wrestled to the ground after he shot Oswald, he said to Jim Lavelle, he said that I really screwed up, didn't I, Jim? Because he knew the cops, he knew Jim, and Jim said, "Yeah, Jack, you really screwed up." He said, "I just wanted to prove the Jews avenged Kennedy. We didn't kill him." And yeah, Jack, okay, and they hauled him off. So the fact that Ruby got there at 11:17, or he was at the Western Union Station at 11:17, walks down 2 minutes or 3 minutes down to the basement of the jail. He got there within seconds. Now, what mob hitman, is going to commit the murder of the century and not be there a little ahead of time, and leave his dog in the car and wait patiently in line to send a meaningless MoneyGram to a stripper? When you look at it, it's absolute insanity. Jack Ruby had nothing to do with the mob. Nobody told him to kill Oswald. But because he knew some Capone guys when he was a teenager in Chicago, and because he dealt with gangsters to get his liquor and his strippers, that means he's a mob hitman. That's all they got. That's their evidence.
And so, in addition to Ruby killing Oswald, another thing that has made people over the decades highly suspicious about it being Oswald acting alone is the way in which the Warren Commission proceeded and some of the flaws in that investigation, and also, I guess, some of the members. Consistently, you hear people point out Alan Dulles as
Sure.
being on the commission. And anyway, so could you talk a little bit about how the commission proceeded and why it did so, and maybe some of the flaws that it probably did have, why that doesn't point towards the conspiracy theory?
Well, in my opinion, it didn't have any flaws except one, having Alan Dulles on the commission. Alan Dulles, and I did a very deep dive on him, interviewed his sister, other relatives. I interviewed assistants who worked for him at the CIA. Got a hold of all his private papers in Rutgers at the library, spoke to everybody who knew him that I could track down. And the real story is that Alan Dulles was extremely close with the Kennedy family, very close. He loved Jackie. They were trading James Bond novels, for years. They were neighbors down in Palm Beach. Alan would vacation down there and hang out with the Kennedys. They considered him Uncle Alan. They looked up to him. Bobby especially really revered Alan, and they kept up a great friendship after the assassination. You see the letters in among his papers between Bobby and Dulles. So he was not any hater of the Kennedys. Alan Dulles was very tight with the Kennedys. In fact, it was Bobby who made one demand of Lyndon Johnson when he said he was going to do a commission. He said, "I want Alan Dulles on the commission," and Johnson was happy to agree with, let him do it. He said, "Sure, anything you want, Bobby." He didn't understand for quite a while why Bobby wanted Alan Dulles on the commission. Well, the answer is to not tell the other commissioners about the Kennedy family plotting to murder Castro, which infuriated Oswald. That would have provided everything the commission needed. The one thing they didn't have was motive. They didn't know we were still at war with Cuba. That was a big secret. We take it for granted now because we found out in the 70s with the Church Committee. They revealed all of these plots that were coming out of the White House. And but the commission didn't know. And so the big flaw was he didn't tell them. I mean, I can picture them turning to Dulles. In fact, I think one of the lawyers told me this happened when they said, "Alan, can you think of any reason why a pro-Castro guy would hate Kennedy?" "I can't think of anything." That was a bald-faced lie. He was one of the originators of the plots. He knew exactly what was going on. And there were decisions made very caustic, just I don't know, self-serving decisions made that JFK had to be looked at as a martyr killed by a nut for no reason, as opposed to JFK was trying to murder Castro and he pissed somebody off who was motivated to kill Kennedy.
And so
Because
just to backtrack a little bit.
yeah,
So prior to the assassination, Oswald spent some time in New Orleans for the Fair
yes,
Play for Cuba. And then he also went down to Mexico City. So could you
yeah,
talk about those two episodes in Oswald's life and their significance vis-a-vis the assassination?
sure. New Orleans is critical because he was separate. It was 1963, the summer, and he was separated from Marina as they broke up off and on all the time because of the way he treated her. So he was in New Orleans pretty much by himself for a while. She joined him eventually, but uh, there, I mean, just by crazy coincidence, he went to the one city. He had relatives there. He went there because he had just tried to murder General Walker in Dallas,
Who was a
and
right wing?
a right wing, yeah, John Bircher, and he tried to murder him, and he wanted to go sort of on the lam. He wanted to get out of town. And Marina said, "Why don't you go back to New Orleans? Maybe you can get a job, and you have relatives there." So he did. And but that circumstance, that happenstance, put him right in the middle of the Cuban exiles who were working with Bobby Kennedy to launch assassination plans, and a new invasion was being planned out of New Orleans, and Oswald was right in the middle of it. So he's going to learn what's really going on with the man that he reveres as a father figure, Fidel Castro. By the way, when Marina was pregnant, they got into one of their biggest fights over what the baby's name was going to be. If it was a boy, Lee wanted to name it Fidel. Imagine that, Fidel Oswald floating around today. So she said, no, there'll be no Fidel in this house. Anyway, so he was entranced with this guy. He had joined this Fair Play for Cuba committee, which was sending him flyers telling him, and I got copies of his own, photocopies of his own flyers in the National Archives, where they were saying what the Kennedys were up to. They've got people down in Costa Rica training for a new invasion, and Oswald was going nuts. So he tried to meet some of them in New Orleans and infiltrate them, blah, 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 and become a spy for Fidel. And so that really is important because that's what really set him on the path to eventually kill the president. Uh, um, and yeah, and then before he comes back to Dallas in the fall, in September of 63, he makes a trip to Mexico City. The reason is, and I found out later that, I mean, the FBI didn't have this, but we did a film where we interviewed a lot of Cuban agents in Mexico. And we found out that Oswald had been writing to the Cuban embassy in Mexico City and trying to get to Fidel's people to say, I want to volunteer. I want to be a spy for Fidel. I'll help the revolution. And they knew he was nuts too. They didn't reply. So at the end of, when he decides to finally come back to Dallas, he said, I'll go to Mexico City first, because if I can make this happen, then I'll join the revolution. And he goes to the Cuban embassy in Mexico City, and a lot of stuff happened there that the Warren Commission never learned about because they weren't told anything about this kind of thing. And in fact, Lyndon Johnson did not want them to look into Mexico City because it would take them right to the heart of Oswald's connections with Cuban espionage folks, which might lead to World War III. Because if the American people, this was Johnson's conclusion, if the American people knew that Oswald was collaborating in some way with Cuban spies when he killed Kennedy, the Americans would demand retribution, invade the island again, a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Johnson wasn't going to go there. So he clamped down on investigations in Mexico City. Anyway, when Oswald was in Mexico, we've learned in recent years, he spent a lot of time with Cubans in Mexico City. He also went to the Soviet embassy, of course. He was trying to get to Cuba, but he had to go to both embassies to get the right paperwork. And they turned him down. They said, well, it'll take 3 or 4 months to get your paperwork all in line. And he just freaked out. And he said, and we have this in FBI documents, that Castro said he knew exactly what Oswald said in those embassies because his people told him. And what Oswald says was, I'll kill that bastard Kennedy for you. Just let me be part of this. And there's a lot of other things. You'll have to read the book. I'm not trying to sell the book, but there's so much great detail about what happened after that with these Cubans and Oswald. But this terrified Lyndon Johnson. He was told he was in good touch with Mexico City the night of the assassination. So what this was really about was not having World War III. The truth of the Castro plots, Oswald meeting with Cuban spies, not just Cubans, Cuban espionage people in the Cuban embassy and outside the Cuban embassy, that would have been enough. And Lyndon Johnson says, I'll take the heat for the cover up, and he did. But we're not going there. And hence, a lot of conspiracy theories fill the void. Why did Johnson? And Johnson went to his grave telling all his confidants that he felt that the Cubans had gotten Oswald to do this. And he said, if it's the last thing I'll do, one day I'll prove it. But he said it. I noted in one of my books at least 7 or 8 times that he said that on the record, that it was all about Cuba. But that couldn't come out in '63. That's the real story.
So, switching up gears a little bit, even though you ultimately concluded that the mob had nothing to do with the assassination of John F. Kennedy, after your research into the Kennedy assassination, you started focusing on organized crime, in particular in Chicago. And so, could you talk to us a little bit about how you developed an interest into that, and then what led you to write your book, The Outfit, about organized crime in Chicago?
Yeah, well, again, here we get to the stream of consciousness that is my life. Nothing is planned, it just sort of falls in. In investigating the Kennedys and plots, what you would find out back in those days was that one of the groups they hired, not the Kennedys, but Eisenhower certainly, was the Chicago mob, was involved in the Castro plots. It was this unholy marriage, as I talked about earlier, to get the mob to try to kill Castro. Well, that's interesting. Looking at Kennedy, I'm told about Chicago. Okay. Then there was Operation Mongoose, in which people like Johnny, that was a plot by the Kennedys to destabilize Castro by having boat raids and bombings against the island. And Johnny Roselli from Chicago was involved in that. And then you find out that JFK was, if you're looking at JFK again, you find Marilyn Monroe. Well, Sam Giancana from Chicago was very close to Marilyn Monroe. Then you find out that Joe Kennedy was very tight with the mobsters because he owned the largest building in the world at the time, the Merchandise Mart. Joe Kennedy owned it. It was the source of his real source of his fortune. But that was all covered by the mobsters and the local corrupt unions. Joe Kennedy knew all those people. Okay, Chicago again. The Merchandise Mart is in Chicago. And then you find out that JFK is sleeping with Sam Giancana's girlfriend, Judy Campbell. All right, so Chicago. I'm saying somebody should do a book about Chicago. So that's how I ended up getting interested in Chicago. It came through all these Kennedy connections. And so I wrote sort of an encyclopedic look at the history of the Chicago outfit and how they got to the kind of power that Joe Kennedy dealt with them, Jack Kennedy dealt with them. Everybody was dealing with them. The CIA, Eisenhower, so I wanted to find out, how did they get to such a place? And it was pretty much quiet. The American public sort of didn't put all that together. How all we heard about was, like the Godfather, New York Mafia, Luciano, blah, blah, blah. And the Chicago mob was doing all the big business. And they were the ones we should have been focused on all along, in my opinion.
Yeah, and so obviously the most famous mobster out of Chicago was Al Capone, but an individual who I've always thought of as being particularly interesting, and one of the reasons why is I had read a book about Elmer Irie from IRS Intelligence, who was one of the great crime fighters and one of the most sophisticated individuals in the U.S. government who actually kind of understood what was happening. And he maintained that he thought the smartest, most sophisticated gangster that he had ever come across was Johnny Torrio.
Right.
Who, by the way, I recently went to a block party in Brooklyn, and it was right next to a cemetery, which I walked up. I walked to the absolute top of the hill, and I saw a big grave for a John Torrio, and I went, "Oh my
Yeah.
God, that's Johnny Torrio. That's his grave." But anyways,
Oh, right. Yeah.
yeah, could you talk a little bit about Johnny Torrio and his role, not only just in Chicago, but in helping to establish the National Crime Syndicate?
Well, I have to say that seeing as I wrote that book 25 years ago, and Torrio took up a page or two in it, I'm trying to a lot of what I knew about Torrio, other people have on the tip of their tongue. I've forgotten some of it, but the most important thing that I can remember is that Torrio, like a lot of Italian immigrants, landed in New York first, and that's where he lived for a while. That's why he's buried there, and uh, there was this pipeline between New York gangsters moving to Chicago, first city to second city. And I think Torrio was one of the first who ended up in Chicago, probably because he was on the lam for something. I can't remember. But he ends up in Chicago at the turn of the century. And he was brilliant in his criminality. He, through battles with the Irish and all the other gangsters, he came out on top where he was the boss of most of the good speakeasies. He had the brothels. He had the gambling joints. He consolidated all of it. This is in 1910, 1915, before Prohibition. He was the guy, and he was brilliant, and he made a fortune. And but he made a lot of enemies, obviously, as well. At one point, again, I'm skipping over stuff because you probably remember more details about him than I do, but he's shot by one of these enemies in 1925. Let me go back a little bit. He was making so many enemies that he needed security, more security to protect himself. And he got his cousin from Brooklyn, back in Brooklyn, to come and help him. His cousin was Al Capone. So Capone gets on the pipeline from New York to Chicago. He comes over and helps protect Johnny's empire. And when Torrio gets shot during Prohibition, he hands it over to Capone, says it's all yours. So that's how we get from Chicago, from Torrio to Capone. And Johnny was a fascinating guy, and you can't understate it, or you can't overstate it. He was brilliant. And I don't know if he may have done short terms in prison, but he died a free man, with his fortune. So, yeah, he was the guy who brought Capone to Chicago. That's the most important thing.
Yeah, and also my understanding is that a lot of times when people think about the mafia in the United States, they associate it with like strictly Sicilian or Italians, but the outfit wasn't exactly like that. And in fact, some of their top, the most brilliant gangsters, people like Murray, the Camel Humphreys, he was Welsh and
Yeah.
involved in labor racketeering. And so, who were some of the figures in the outfit like Humphreys that you found to be the most fascinating and most interesting to read and write about?
Well, just to be clear, the outfit were the successors to Capone, in my definition of them. Capone had the syndicate. When he went away to prison, um, his young Turks took over, and they called themselves, or they were known as the outfit. I don't know who called them that first, but that's one of the nicknames for them. Um, and Yeah, there were. There's nobody like Humphreys. Humphreys he was his Welsh consigliere, and that's important again that you point that out because the outfit was not mafia, in my opinion. That they were organized crime, and if you could produce and if you were an earner, you could be at the table. So there were Jewish people, there were Irish, there were Welsh, there were everybody, but it was mostly Italians, and the deal was an Italian always had to be in charge of the outfit. But at the table, there was anybody who could do the job was invited. And by far, Murray Humphreys, who pretty much mastered art of labor racketeering, um, was a fascinating guy, absolute genius, self-taught. He could have been a great lawyer. He spent all his free hours reading Martindale Hubbell law books, and he helped with the defenses of a lot of these guys. But he also oversaw the union takeovers of businesses. By that I mean these guys like Accardo, who was Accardo and Ricca and Nitti, these Italian guys became the leaders of the outfit. They were never going to take over Sears or Motorola or these big corporations and become president of those companies, but they wanted the money. So how could they do it? And Murray Humphreys came up with this, or perfected this great extortion where if we can just take over all the unions, we can control those organizations from the bottom. We don't have to be the president. If we dictate when the strikes happen, the president will have to of those companies will have to answer to us. So it was a phenomenal way of running big corporations without really running them. And so Murray, one by one, he picked off all these unions, and pretty much they were in control of hotels and Teamsters and food, you name it. They had liquor, milk. They had all the unions. They were de facto running these big companies, and they became ridiculously wealthy in doing that. So that's who Murray was. But he was fascinating in other ways because he was just so smart that the FBI guys who ended up following him around came to really like him, because he had a sense of humor. He wasn't going around shooting people. He was just a well-read, well-spoken guy that everybody seemed to like, and that was his life. Eventually, they caught up with him in the 60s, but for a long time, he had free reign. And he also expanded the outfit's reach well outside of Chicago. That was the other big thing. Those unions became national unions, motion picture theaters, Teamsters, that all came out of Chicago. And if he was the guy who really was there at the beginning, so that when you see Teamsters running movie sets in Hollywood, ultimately that came back to Chicago. They still ran those unions, building Las Vegas. Those construction unions were owned by the same group of guys out of Chicago, although their names weren't technically associated with it. So it was huge. It became a multi-state, almost national enterprise through labor racketeering, and that was Murray Humphreys.
Yeah, and is it also the case, was he the first person that figured out you could plead the fifth in Congress?
Yeah. One of his many genius things was he advised Giancana and Accardo and Nitti, any of those guys, when they were hauled before Congress, he would say, well, just plead the fifth. He had researched that in his reading of all the law books, that was their right. And that had never been done before. People had pled the fifth in a courtroom, but never before Congress. And he would write it out on an index card for these guys to read when these congressmen would ask him a question. They'd say, I plead the fifth, blah, blah, blah. And the congressman, and I have the transcripts of some of these hearings, the congressman would say, you can't do that. That's not you can't do that on Capitol Hill. And Humphreys would whisper in their ear, yes, you can, into the mobster's ear. And they'd take a break and they would go off and research it. And they'd find out, well, yes, they can. And now it's pretty much been done ever since. Anytime a gangster gets hauled before like the Kefauver Commission or anything else, that's one of Murray's many legacies. But he was brilliant. He could have been one of the most successful businessmen. If he had gone straight, he was just that intelligent. And but he had a different path.
So I think there's a general interest in America and the gangster. They obviously occupy a big part of our film history and whatnot. But one of your books, which is an excellent book, I mean, all your books are excellent, but one of the books I particularly found that I learned an immense amount from reading was Supermob.
Yeah.
And in Supermob, you're talking about a group of people that are connected to organized crime, but you wouldn't say like a classic gangster with a gat shooting people.
Right.
They're kind of like lawyers, businessmen, financiers, real estate developers, certain people involved in politics who
Hmm.
seem to kind of bridge or serve as an interface between legitimate business and the illicit world of the rackets and the underworld and whatnot. So, how did you get interested in this milieu that you came to describe as the super mob? And if you want to kind of describe that world a little bit in more detail, yeah, how did you get interested in that?
Well, it's a 600-page book, so this might take a minute. Uh, we're talking about the upper world and the underworld. That's how I broke it down, and uh, essentially, you had a bunch of swarthy Italian gangsters, some tough guys for sure, uh, who were branching out, and they had certain needs. One of their big needs was how do they launder the money, because that's what got Capone in trouble. He couldn't account for his taxes, and like you say, IRE got him, the tax people got him, not the FBI, and so they had to figure. They were making so much money. Um, and they were dealing with big corporations through the unions. They needed liaisons who could they needed attorneys, first of all, who weren't representing them in court, but were showing them ways they could quasi-legally bury their money the way millionaires do today. Non-criminal millionaires have lots of ways to hide their money. There's all these loopholes in the tax code. So these lawyers would point out to them. So they brought people in. Murray Humphreys brought in Sidney Korshak as a sort of a protege. Sidney Korshak was the next most fascinating guy, a Jewish attorney, and there's strong evidence that the Capone outfit or Capone syndicate paid for his law school. Anyway, he became their first quote unquote fair haired boy. Oh, by the way, another thing I should say, how did I get into it? He said, two things. I had read Seymour Hersh's 4-part series in the New York Times about Sidney Korshak, and it was just mind blowing. This was in the 70s. He wrote this, and it sort of disappeared. But I urge people to find it on the interweb. Seymour Hersh and Jeff Girth wrote 4 parts on Sidney Korshak at a time when it was very difficult to get information because the FBI files weren't available. Korshak and the gangsters were still alive to protect them. Anyway, that was the first thing, Seymour Hersh's 4-part series. Another thing was when I first went to Chicago to research the book, I'm crazy. I looked up all the gangsters and called them up. Said, can I interview you? And, being Italian, maybe that helped, of Italian descent. And I got to know a bunch of them, some of the real wise guys who were close with the big families. And a few of them told me, yeah, we'll talk to you about the early history on one condition. You tell about our partners on the upper world. That they said that 3 or 4 times to me. They said it's not just us, and it's always been presented as these bad Italian guys. And he said we had people that you've never heard of in the business world who were working with us hand in glove. I said I'm happy to do it. Go for it. Like I don't care like with the Kennedy case, I really don't care what the answer is, just so it's true. And so they worked with me. Anyway, so I said when I finished the outfit book, I said, okay, I'm going to look into this world that they were referring to. And, what had happened was, and this is really a mind-blowing thing, it was to me, you may know this, but, if you look closely at all the Italian gangs, whether they're in New York or Vegas or Chicago or LA, the leaders were always partnered with a Jewish guy, very often an attorney, but not always. In New York, you had Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky. Capone had Abe Teitelbaum. Mo Dalitz and the Purple Gang had their Italian partners. Bugsy Siegel was linked to Costello and Luciano. Murder Incorporated was made up of Italians working for Albert Anastasia. And I'm saying, wait a minute, this is what they're talking about. And after I wrote the book, I think it was after I don't think I had this in the book. Did I? maybe, well, whatever. I learned that there's an explainable, understandable reason for this natural affinity between Italians and Jews. And one of the things it goes back to, uh, are you aware of a lot of Italians emigrated to, I mean, a lot of Jews uh, emigrated to Sicily hundreds of years ago. And I had never studied this or was aware of it. Now, three of my grandparents are from Sicily. Um, and they assimilated into Sicilian culture. They changed their names to Italianized names. The name for these people is conversos. These are Jewish Italians. Okay. One of the names they used they changed to was Accardo. Tony Accardo was the boss of the Chicago outfit. Another name they used, the Jewish conversos, was Luciano. I've seen the emigration papers and all the geology, uh, uh, all the work that the entomology on these people, and it's mind blowing. So to me, that explained the natural association and trust between Jews and Italians. Well, these Jews very often were much better educated because that's a part of the religion. They stress education. And so they were attorneys, they were accountants, exactly what these guys needed, what the Italians needed. So they would say it was a matter of mixing Italian muscle and Jewish brains. And it was labeled the kosher nostra. So, again, it's a long story, but that's the start of it. And so their partners, their non-Italian partners, represented them in real estate matters, in tax matters, in union matters, in dealing with heads of Hollywood studios. Sidney Korshak was a major connection to the Hollywood studios and extorting them over if you're making a movie, you have to come through me first, because if you don't, I'll call a strike on your Teamsters and your guild, your various other guilds, which I control. So countless, hundreds of movies over the years paid an upfront fee to Sidney Korshak, who would send it to Chicago. I mean, Korshak literally talked about how he was based in Los Angeles at this point. He was sent out by Accardo, and if the head of MCA or Universal was going to make a movie, they'd call Sidney and say, Sidney, we're making a movie. The budget's $3 million. What's it going to cost us, in fees? And Sidney would say, oh, I'll call you back. And he would call Accardo and say, okay, call Lou Wasserman back at Universal and say, hey, Lou, it's you can have no problems for $100,000. Great. They write the check. And that went on every day. They were so powerful. So that's just one example. The same thing went on in Las Vegas with the construction unions and the owners of the hotels and blah, blah, blah. And these were the Supermob because they weren't in the headlines. They were untouchable. They got away with all this for a century. Korshak, they followed Sidney Korshak for 50 years. I got his FBI file, 7,000 pages. They never nailed him. They never could.
The involvement of certain people like Johnny Rosselli and Sam Giancana in the anti-Castro activities I guess they did that through Robert Mayhew and the CIA. Did that contribute towards their kind of untouchability? The fact that they had information that certain elements of the U.S. government would find embarrassing?
That card may have been played in the 60s up until, a lot of people got wiped out. The people who knew firsthand, Giancana, Rosselli, they were all assassinated in the 70s and others. So that card may have, been played for about 10 years. But after that, they had dirt on everything. But see, the thing is, Korshak and the Supermob had dirt on practically everybody because so many politicians were corrupt. They didn't dare bother these guys because they knew these guys were smarter than the Italians. The Italian muscle guys, Korshak and those people knew all the politicians who were being bribed. They bribed a bunch of them. So they didn't have to bring up the Cuba plots.
Right.
That was ancient history, you know,
Korshak represented Jimmy Hoffa, is that correct?
for a time. Yeah. And he knew all about the murder. He knew that the murder was going down and what happened. Uh, he, and he knew Hoffa as Humphreys did. Because he was the Teamsters boss and they ran the Teamsters. So Hoffa really took orders from people like Humphreys and Korshak. So when you hear about, what happened to Jimmy Hoffa, where's he buried and all this, that's great to talk about. But what you don't know is that he was being controlled by these same Chicago guys. The Teamsters were, I mean, it was a gold mine for the mob. Controlling the Teamsters, which was Humphrey's idea, to put Hoffa in as head of the Teamsters, because then they controlled the pension fund, which was hundreds of millions of dollars. All the Teamsters, thousands of Teamsters around the country contributed to the pension fund, which made loans to get interest as funds do. They further invest. So the Teamsters would invest in things, but the Chicago mob needed somewhere to get money to build casinos or do whatever they wanted, because they couldn't do it with their own money, because they needed a bank. A regular bank wouldn't give them a loan, and they couldn't use their own cash that was buried in their backyard, or the FBI would get suspicious. So they had to have a bank that they could use up front. And this is what the Supermob helped them construct, was let's use the Teamsters pension fund to build everything, to build restaurants, hotels, whatever, casinos. Let's build Las Vegas, but you can't do it with your own cash. You had to have, a legitimate loan, even though they really didn't need the money. They needed the cover. So that's, what Korshak and those guys did. And that's the Hoffa connection to those guys, because he really ultimately worked for them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yes, that's fascinating. And another important organization was MCA, Music Corporation of America, which eventually was originally from Chicago, I believe, is the case.
Yeah, they worked with Al Capone. They were hand in glove again with the Chicago outfit. The Chicago outfit helped MCA get started. They stayed friends with the executives, Lou Wasserman, Jules Stein before him, who came out of Chicago and worked with Capone. They started by taking over theaters in the Chicago area, and they did that with help from Capone. So they had a relationship. When Jules Stein moves to Hollywood with Lou Wasserman to build Universal MCA, which is still just a giant film corporation today, they stayed in touch with all these guys because they needed control over the Hollywood unions, these executives, and they had to keep them in line. So it was a brotherhood. They knew each other from the old days. A lot of these big Hollywood moguls knew the outfit before they were all famous. In Hollywood, they were all Chicago for the most part. There's a lot of Chicagoans. And when I visit LA and I look at and they invested in a ton of real estate, the Chicago mob just bought hundreds and hundreds of prime Los Angeles real estate through their Supermob people. And to the point where when I go out there, I'm looking around, I'm looking at all these banks and these hotels, and I'm thinking, this is Chicago West. That's how I think of Los Angeles. They dumped so much money into Los Angeles and Hollywood that's one of their big legacies that most people don't really appreciate. But that again, to get to your question, that's Lou Wasserman and Jules Stein came from Chicago with the help of the outfit and took over Hollywood. And then they also, not Lou Wasserman, but the mob also, the same guys created Las Vegas out of thin air.
With the help of the Central States Pension Fund of the...
Right. This was their answer to losing Cuba. They had casinos in Cuba, and once they had the pension fund, they didn't care about Cuba anymore. They said, we're going to, build this thing out in the desert. And it was a brilliant concept. The idea that if you have casinos, they're already rigged in the owner's favor. They still are, right? All the games are rigged. That was a legitimate way to make money. So the problem was they eventually got too greedy and they were stealing from the losers' pot of money, all the tourists, when they would lose their cash. The outfit, the mobsters would skim it off the top in the count room before the IRS ever found out about any of this money. So it was like invisible money. They couldn't handle it. They were already making money off of legal winnings and earnings in the casinos, but this pile of cash in the back room, they just couldn't ignore it. And that's what ultimately got them in trouble.
And was that like involving Anthony Spilotro and
Yeah,
these guys?
yeah,
The movie Casino kind of deals with that a little bit.
exactly. Tony Spilotro and they were controlling the skim, not just him, but there were a number of guys out there skimming the money, and they were bringing it through Kansas City back to Chicago and spread it around to a lot of the different mob families around the country. But it was a side, in my opinion, the Chicago mob had more to do with it than anybody. Uh, Sidney Korshak ran the Riviera Hotel Casino for years. He and Roselli ran about five or six of the biggest places. And these were Chicago guys. I'll tell you to what extent a crossover between Vegas and Hollywood that's kind of amusing. Sidney Korshak ended up living in Beverly Hills, and one of his best buddies was a man named Cubby Broccoli, who was a big Hollywood producer. And he was a friend of the family. They were neighbors, and Cubby got into the James Bond business. He was the guy who started the James Bond movies. And there was one movie that they needed to film in Las Vegas. So Cubby knows Sidney is Mr. Las Vegas. So he says to him one day, he says, "Hey, Sid, we're doing this thing in Las Vegas. Are we going to have to pay to not have a strike?" And Sid, "No, Cubby, your friend, you won't have to worry about it. I'll take care of it. You can use my hotel, the Riviera, for shooting your indoor scenes," which they did. That was sitting in the James Bond movie. What was the name of it? Diamonds Are Forever. Those casino scenes are in Sydney's Riviera. And then so Cubby says, "Oh, that's great. Thank you, Sidney." And Sidney then says, "Just one more thing I want to say before you guys start working. My girlfriend's going to be the star." And Cubby Broccoli says, "Excuse me?" He said, "We have Natalie Wood's sister, Lana Wood, is the female lead." And he said, "No, no, no. You want Las Vegas. You want it to be no problem. Put my girlfriend in." And his girlfriend did become the star, and you would know her name, Jill St. John, and that was one of Sydney's mistresses, and that gave her big start. I interviewed Lana Wood among many other people about this, and Lana Wood told me, she said, "Yeah," she said, "I never understood. I was supposed to be the star, and we had worked it out and signed contracts and blah blah blah, and then at the last minute, I was a B actor in it. I had a bit part, and I never knew why." I said, "Well, Sydney had a good," and she said she found out later. Of course, Jill St. John was the reason. So there you've got Hollywood, Vegas, the Supermob all coming together in one conversation. And that happened a lot. Sidney put a lot of his friends in the movies. And yeah, just a wild, wild story.
And one of the actors known as Ronald Reagan, he was represented by, is that Lew Wasserman? Is that correct?
Yeah, Lew Wasserman was kind of his mentor and consigliere. Lew Wasserman ran MCA Universal, which was the giant. And he had Ronald Reagan as his protege there. What happened was Reagan had become president of the Screen Actors Guild in the early 50s, I think it was. And at the time, it was considered, it still is, it's illegal to have a film studio like Universal also represent actors, right? You couldn't do both. That was conflict of interest. And when Reagan became head of the Screen Actors Guild, he made a private deal with Lew Wasserman because he wanted to curry favor with him. He said, "Well, you can have a waiver. Your company can do both." So to have actors trying to negotiate their contracts with a studio, and the studio owns both the agency that's representing them and the studio, and the filmmakers, it's ridiculous. It's absurd. It was the great backstabbing of the Hollywood actors, and they resented Reagan to this day, uh, for stabbing all the actors in the back like that. But it propelled Ronald Reagan, thanks to the power of Lew Wasserman. He gave him as one of his prizes. He gave him a ranch, but he also gave him a thing called General Electric Theater to be the host of it, which was a very popular TV show in the 50s that put Ronald Reagan in the front of the public, and his career just went from there. And for the rest of his life, he had Lew Wasserman backing him, right on through to his governorship aspirations, presidency, you name it. Lew was his man, and that's how he got that favor of General Electric Theater, was by stabbing all the actors in the back and letting Lew control both sides of the negotiations.
Yeah, and a lot of the major hotel chains seem to have connections to Korshak. I believe Hyatt, which
Oh,
the Pritzker family was
yeah.
involved with, and they received funding again, I believe, from the Central States Pension Fund.
Hmm.
And I don't know if it was, was Hilton also
Yep.
close?
Oh yeah, Hilton, Hyatt, all the big chains. A lot of them had executives, or they had started Pritzker out of Chicago. Pritzker owned Hyatt, and they could not have existed without the working with the outfit, because the outfit controlled all the hotel unions. And so they had a friendly relationship, and that went on for years. The hotel business was a great deal for the outfit. They made tons of money off of all these big hotel chains. And it's the kind of thing you don't hear about much, because all you see is The Godfather, you guys shooting each other up on, in Manhattan, boom, boom, boom. But behind the scenes, these guys were running the biggest hotel chains, the biggest Hollywood studios, the biggest casinos and hotels. But it wasn't as I don't want to say glamorous, but it wasn't as exciting or sexy as machine guns in downtown New York. So they were happy they weren't drawing that kind of attention to themselves. They just wanted the money. And it was an amazing thing what they pulled off for most of the 20th century, that they were able to be the power behind the power. But they needed that connection to the supermob guys to smooth it over with the deal making and the money laundering.
Yeah, well, Gus, I think we're approaching the hour and a half mark, and I think that's a great place to end our conversation. But I just want to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to speak with me today. And maybe briefly, if you just want to tell me what do you have in your immediate future, things that you're working on in terms of films or books, or what's your next move?
Well, the publishing business has kind of fallen down in a lot of ways. If you're not Kim Kardashian, you can't get a decent book deal, uh, and you don't have to be a writer; you just have to be a celebrity. A lot of my fellow authors, we've seen our advances just cut in half over the last 15 years. So I'm spending more time amortizing my books into films, and I've been pretty fortunate. I've got 4 projects in development with major studios, and it's a very exciting time. I'm spending a lot of time with screenwriters, helping them develop the projects, and they're happening. The outfit is under option to one of the biggest developers of TV series in history. He's done so many shows, and he's got the pilot right now where he's going through it. Hopefully, we'll get that sold to a network, but he's sold hundreds of shows to networks, so it might not be too difficult. My last book with Eric Desenhall was Best of Enemies, an espionage book that was purchased by the same folks who did Oppenheimer, and they're working with Amazon and MGM, and they've got one of the top screenwriters in Hollywood working on it right now. Short answer to your question, I'm working on those things every day as a consultant. The phone sort of rings, and I help them through their writing or their research. And what else? Another mob story that I put together is being developed in Hollywood, and working on that a lot. What else? A couple other things that are under option out there. So I'm juggling 6 or 7 probably big projects, that should come to fruition in the next year or so. And but Hollywood's a slow game, but they pay you, so that's good. But it's a slow game to get things actually to screen. But they're coming. I can tell you this because it's been in the papers. The spy book, Best of Enemies, we've got already signed on this top screenwriter who wrote Top Gun, Maverick, American Hustle, and I talk to him almost every day. Great guy. He's full bore ahead on this thing. So we got him to write the Best of Enemies a story, a feature screenplay. We've got Christian Bale and Bradley Cooper committed to being in it. And there's another A-list actor who I can't name who desperately wants to be in it. So he's trying to craft a role for him. And so that's huge. That's huge. Estimated $100 million project with all these big name characters. So that's in the works. And that I can tell you about. That was actually the biggest bidding war in Hollywood last year was for that book. You can look it up in Deadline and Variety. It was a front page story. All 10 studios bidded for that story, and we were very fortunate to get some great people. So that's what I'm doing, working on those things.
Well, I'm a huge fan of your writing, and I can't wait to watch the movies. And again, thank you so much, Gus Russo. Read
Well,
his
my
book,
pleasure.
watch the movies.
Thank you. My pleasure. Yep. Take care.